First of all, I want to thank again Talal and Ahmad and everybody else on the Global Center Amman team. Could we please thank them? This has been an extraordinary effort, and you just have no idea what it's like to work with people who do it right when you spend a lot of time working with people who don't do it right. So, and I don't mean my colleagues at Columbia. I mean sometimes you show up at places and you end up spending a lot of time doing cleanup. Thank you guys, really. Also, a little later, at some point in the next 12 to 24 hours, Ariel will be sending out a evaluation, which is a SurveyMonkey quick document. We will try to get it translated into Arabic, but please do it. It's very important both for our own kind of internal process as we develop programs to figure out what works and what doesn't, and also it's important for the funders. And that leads me to say also that I want to thank again the Two Lilies Fund and Jane, Bernard Van Leer Foundation, and Melissa, who is still here from them, the Jacobs Foundation, which is Alex has left, but they're fantastic, and the Maria Cecilia Vigidal Foundation from Maria Cecilia Suoto Vigidal Foundation from Brazil, all of which made this possible. This is you've been part of a program that is the first of its kind in the world, and these funders really rolled the dice. They took a big gamble on bringing 22 journalists together. This is a great thing, so thank you guys. Quick overview of today, and then we'll sort of get down to business. We are going to start out by moving our professional discussion for a little while to the terrain of visual journalism, photo and video, and where that fits into this equation, and I'll have a little bit more to say about that in a minute. After the break, we will focus on the question of emotional self-care. Khalid and I will talk about that together, and we'll have a bit of a discussion on that. Then we'll break, and after lunch, what we've got on the program we're calling story pitching coaching sessions. What I think I would like you to be thinking about ahead of that, first of all, we'll see where it goes. It could be any kind of conversation in a way. But I would like you to be thinking about, coming out of this week, if you had one story to pitch to either your editor if you are a staffer or if you're pitching as a freelancer, you just have one story to pitch. What might it be? Because I think we might try that out on each other, see how it goes. Okay? Any questions or thoughts coming out of yesterday before we move into today's discussion? It certainly was a kind of a big, rich conversation yesterday. Any questions, thoughts, theories? To the extent that you remember it, I mean, I know my own capacity for these things is pretty limited. Okay, then I'm going to move us into the first session. And I think actually to do that, I'm going to also shift mics and do it from down here because it's easier. Yeah. One of them. So, in general, it's really important to include questions of photography and video and visual depictions in any reporting about trauma-drenched issues, about kids, anything. It's an important part of journalism, and certainly we always integrate photography and visual journalism generally into Dart Center programs. But it's particularly so when we're talking about children who are refugees and these questions of drawing public attention to early childhood. There is no bit of terrain that is more ridden with cliche than depiction of refugees. And of course, the thing with cliches, whether visual or written, is that cliches short circuit thinking. They short circuit innovation. They short circuit engagement. I've seen that picture before. Okay, I'm done. I don't need to think anymore. So innovations in stories, in visual subject, in visual approach, in visual narrative are central to arousing public attention, to arousing public engagement in these issues. In addition, with visual journalism, we're struggling even more than in some ways with written journalism, with this dichotomy between sensation and arousal and I'm going to turn the page. I can't look, I must look, is a tension that a lot of people carry in our heads, right? And photographers and documentary filmmakers, all of you are struggling back and forth with that tension between I can't look, I must look. You're trying to understand it and being there. You're trying to arouse emotion and at the same time advance thinking and not have pure sensation, too much emotion. The questions of dignified portrayal versus graphic or distressing portrayal are complex. The ethical issues are complex. The issues involving public attention versus public compassion fatigue are very complex. We are lucky to have, first of all, in this room, a lot of you are full or part-time visual journalists, photographers, documentary filmmakers, and all of us these days, even truly terrible photographers like me, are multimedia journalists. So this is a subject that has to engage all of us. We're lucky to have two extraordinary photojournalists up here, and I'm going to, for the sake of video, even though you now have socialized, drunk with, done everything with everyone up here, we are going to introduce them formally. So, on my immediate right, Sima Diab is a Syrian-American photographer based in Cairo and in Beirut. Her photographic work focuses on environmental and social conditions in the Arab diaspora and Arab world, including refugee and migration, climate change, and water scarcity. She's lived and worked across the Middle East in Damascus, Dubai, Beirut, and Baghdad until setting up base between Cairo and Beirut in 2007. Her work has been published in the New York Times, M Magazine, Le Monde, The Guardian, BuzzFeed News, LA Times. I could go on and on and on. She also works extensively with NGO and aid organizations like Save the Children, the UN agencies, and others. Diab received the 2016 James Foley Award for Conflict Reporting, was a selected winner for the American Photography Best of Photography 2015. She's a 2015 grant recipient of the Arab Documentary Photography Program from the AFAC Prince Claus Fund and the Magnum Foundation. She's a member of the Frontline Freelance Register, free ad, it's a great organization, and the Overseas Press Club. To my extreme right, which is not a political statement at all, is Tanya Habjouqa. Yes. It's early in the morning and it's caffeine. Tanya Habjouqa is an award-winning photographer, journalist, and educator based in East Jerusalem. Her practice links social documentary, collaborative portraiture, and participant observation. Her principal interests include gender, representations of otherness, dispossession, and human rights, with a particular concern for ever-shifting socio-political dynamics in the Middle East. Trained in journalism and anthropology, with an MA in global media and emphasis on Middle East politics from the University of London, SOAS, Habjouqa produces in-depth narratives that offer nuanced alternatives to mainstream media depictions of her subjects. I will say that one of Ariel's and my colleagues at Columbia University, Professor Nina Berman, who teaches photography there, was one of the first people we approached to ask who some good visual journalists would be to include in this, and Tanya was the person. She simply said, "Oh, you have to include Tanya, so you're here." I'm not sure which order you guys want to go in, but each will present for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll have the customary conversation.
Can we hit the lights, please?
Jeremy, would you mind hitting the lights?
Full transparency, I'm also in a photo agency with Nina Bertman.
I should have said that. And I apologize for actually not mentioning it.
Oh, no, it's okay. Okay. I'm going to start with a video. Oh, that's loud. Can you hear me from here? Okay, good. I'm going to start with a video and then speak.
بابا وماما ربوني علموني وربوني يا رب تخلي بابا وماما ربوني يا رب شلونك يابا شلونك انت مليح
مساء الخير يا رنود، كيفك انت بابا؟ ان شاء الله بخير، وهاي احلى وردات الك يا بابا، وكمان بيعطيك بوسه. ها
بابا مرحبا شلونك شو اخبارك جيب لي روب ابيض مثل تبع لنا وزهري ونهدي كيفك أبي إن شاء الله منيح شلونك إن شاء الله أوضاعك شلون الجو عندك شو عم تعمل شو أكلت اليوم
والله أنا الحمد لله. أنت شو أخبارك يا أبي؟ إن شاء الله عم تروح على المدرسة صيرة شاطرة ها؟
الأخير رب الصوت والله يا قلب يا أخي يا منيس يا أخي الحمد لله أن أمورنا تمام. بدي ألمك من كل البلاد العرب لأنه أمي بلاد العرب والله العظيم ما فيها غير الذل. الله العظيم لأجيبك وعايشك أحلى عيشة أحسن من كل الأوب اللي عندك هناك. كل أخوات منيوك والله يا منيس. أما بتيجي لهون معززة مكرمة. والله العظيم يا محمد شو مشتاق لك شو مشتاق اقعد معك اجي وينك الصبح قاعد اسوي لك القهوه من تحت ايدي يا منيس.
يابا انت وين؟ انت وين بتركيا وبالسويد؟ وين انت؟
So I'm just going to jump right into the critique off of that. That assignment came, so in full transparency, this is a photograph of my family, my father in the middle, in Amman oh, right. Oh, I can do that, yeah, I'm a mover. In Amman in 1967. So we come from a minority group, the Circassians, but my mother is Texan. So as a result of the schism, and a seductive Lebanese stewardess who seduced my pilot father, I ended up in Texas most of my life, which is why I'm much more comfortable in English. Lots of wine, we can revert to Arabic, but that's another story. But as a result of this, of not looking and not fitting, I quite often have to justify my existence of any place that I'm at. Who are you? What are you? And I think that actually helps with the sort of storytelling that I do in the ability to connect perpetual insider-outsider. It's a natural documentary state. So that previous clip that you saw came about from a UNHCR assignment. And I was really excited because, as many of you working in news know, we don't often get, despite stories of giant breadth and needing nuance, we usually get a day, 2 if we're lucky. And so a 2-month assignment was fantastic. But I had been working already on my own on a long-term project on focusing on Syrian women, the urban refugees in Jordan. And I'd worked at those relationships, and the access was hard-earned, but it was a sincere connection. Whereas suddenly I had a driver, but I had to wear this giant F-off UN badge. And so I would have immediate access. People would see it, open the door, and just start spilling their stories. But it was uncomfortable. I was uncomfortable with that power, and I also didn't like the quality of the information that I was getting. It was desperate, and it was, and I would always say, I'm just here to document. I'm not the one who's going to be able to get you out of here. But the majority of those stories and visuals that I had towards the end of the assignment, I was deeply unsatisfied with. And it was when the mass exodus, before the powers that be plotted to stop that movement and keep the majority of Syrians here and in Lebanon. It was when the images, really dramatic, horrific images, I'm forgetting, Ilan Kurdi? The heartbreaking image, like this is what, and I'm in a tents and in urban refugee situations, and I just was so deeply dissatisfied because I didn't feel I had done justice visually to the stories that had been shared with me. And it was towards the end of that time, by chance, I was interviewing a woman, and the baby was so agitated and the mother was so exhausted that she could barely comfort the child. And sort of as an afterthought to shut the child up, and I have done the same thing. I mean, I understood why she wanted to do that. She pushed play on one of her WhatsApp messages, and it was the voice of the father who had already, migrated to Germany. And the father was singing a lullaby. And it was amazing because the child's, little fist and anger, it just sort of calmed down. And I was mesmerized. And I said, wow. And so I started asking her about those conversations. And then I had the inspired idea, I had just a week left, of the rest of those interactions, gathering as many of the WhatsApp messages as possible. Now, the funny thing about that is I gave what was in the contract to UNHCR. And as had been agreed when I joined, the concept was women left behind. They wanted to focus on how women were surviving here with limited, diminishing resources as the men were leaving. Well, politically, suddenly they had an about change. They're like, oh, we don't really want to emphasize that or talk about the exodus. So basically, all of your work for the last 2 months, thank you very much. Of course, I was paid, but... So the video was like, it was an extra. I gave it as an extra because I felt very strongly about it. And they didn't use the video. So I released it myself through Time Magazine, and it went viral. WhatsApp is still using it on their website. And ironically, a UNHCR representative in Dubai contacted me and said, this is amazing, can we use it? I was like, well, funny story that, But, so to come my about face of my work and the evolution, I began very much as a news photographer, writer. I began as a writer and then moved into photography. And I worked in the wires, and I'm going to show you a selection of images that was my turning point about why I don't want to do mainstream visual journalism anymore. It was the Lebanon war. It was the Israel war on Lebanon in 2006. And that was I'd been photographing in Iraq, Darfur, a very different sort of low-level, quiet, unseen violence, as opposed to, it was the first time I'd seen First World weaponry dropped on civilian populations. And it was really jarring, and I was enraged, and I didn't have any power over those images because I was working for Bloomberg. And so I would give the pictures, and they would only move the pictures that they wanted to. And I just didn't feel that the narrative I was capturing was being conveyed. And so it was, I'll just show you a few of those images. Dahya, fleeing woman in Bin Jubail. There I was. Hezbollah, Nasrallah surviving one of the bombings in the south. The day of victory in Dahya, the last day. And there were victory signs everywhere. And it was really jarring because we'd been documenting just how many dead there were. And I'd never seen that much devastation. I remember just standing there and sort of turning, not knowing where I could get a frame because it was just so much carnage. And it was actually this that was the final straw for me. It was one of the days before the last day, and the morgues were so filled that they didn't have enough room for the bodies. And so these were trucks that they were filling body parts and bodies. And we moved in packs because it was very dangerous. There was no other way to work visually. And so we stood in a half moon around him as he worked, going through the bodies, and there was no electricity, so there was the heavy smell. And the worker just sort of short-circuited and lost it and started screaming at us. Oh, you want to see dead bodies? You want to see dead bodies? Here's an arm, here's a leg, here's a dead mother, here's a dead baby. And I just remember putting down my camera and just feeling so sick and realizing that I was not engaging and commenting and documenting in the method that I wanted to. And that was what made me stop mainstream wire journalism. And I actually paused from photography entirely for a couple of years. And I went to SOAS and I worked, because I knew if I wanted to critique the media, I would need something behind me. So I still hope to go on and do a PhD. I stopped at a master's and then came back into the field. So that should be orange, but that's okay. It's not reading it as orange. So I'm going to show you. So now the way that I work on long form projects. And when possible, I actually make my own immersive realities. And I've come to work with, there's a couple of great designers in New York that I work with. And of course, not all of you, maybe, I apply for a lot of funds and I get funding so that I can pay these partners. But at the same time, like in Khalil, we've got amazing techies rising up. We have it here in the region. So it's a way of circumventing the gatekeepers who might otherwise not give the full color that you're hoping to in the narrative that you've documented. So with that, I'll be completely transparent. Bukra fil Mishmish, this was 5 years. Here, I'll show you on the actual website itself. Let's see, hopefully nobody closed that. No, they did not. So this is still not orange, but that's okay. So this was, the project came about from conversations with the woman, and it was a woman who was just like, Bukra fil mishmish, And it sounds very poetic, but it's a very dark phrase, sort of like, yeah, when pigs fly, it's never going to happen. And also, the Palestinians use it because the mishmish season is super short, so you don't actually get a lot of, anyway. So I put it in 3 chapters. The majority from 2012 to 2017, focusing on the martyrs' wives' buildings, women that were their husbands had died, and they were housed in, there's like 3 buildings still paid by Qataris and Saudis for humanitarian reasons. Syria via WhatsApp, and the section of testimonies from UNHCR that I've turned into a section that I hope that perhaps could be used for ICC or future criminal research. And then the final one that ended last year, where I ended and it's basically where refugees are that are still here today, the ones that it's so bad here that they're going back despite the fear. And overt rise in rapes and far darker things. It was actually the murder and rape and desecration of the body of a 7-year-old boy that was actually living in one of the Palestinian camps that sort of made me come back and finalize the chapter. So this world that I've created, I've never had so much, I had 5 years of material that I put together from UN assignments, NGO assignments, Le Monde assignments, and my personal work. And I got to go through that archive and narrate the way I wanted to. Now, the downside to this is that no media wants to touch it. Like, I'll go to New York and I'll show it to different editors and they'll be like, and it's nuanced. It's what you hope you can do, but at the same time, it's a lot. And I'm like, well, we could pull from it and curate something different. But one critique of these alternative universes, it is an answer for a lot of things, but not everything. They don't want to drive traffic off of their website, certainly even if you can bring it back. And it's a lot. Now, the success of it is it's going around museums and galleries around the world, from Australia, San Francisco. And I usually mix this with a installation. So these beautiful, not orange, should be orange on the video curtains. It's these cream curtains with these hideous brown dots. And in one of the buildings of the Martyrs' Wives, every apartment is identical. It's the same hideous curtains, which are always closed, despite the fact that they're stuck indoors all day. And it is the same simple furniture. So that was the other issue I came across, is meeting these women initially on a Le Monde assignment who you didn't see because we were there for the FSA fighters. and you wouldn't see the woman, you would see a hand and a tray of coffee and a hand and a tray of fruit. And I became curious about them, so I sidestepped from my assignment later and started a relationship with these women, which one by one, the men started, who were fighters, the men started to die. So I documented a hopeful period when people even enjoyed and were saying freedom fighter, to a very different, terrorism. Other words started to be civil war. It started to, revolution wasn't used anymore. And they were not as welcome in the communities. And so I documented that. But, oh, did I step on something? Okay, thank you. But as a result of that, what happened is their testimonies, the friendships, the long term, I would go and visit them, and to come from Ramallah, it's expensive. So, and I would sometimes come and not get any picture. And after a while, I was like, is this worth continuing? But their stories were so strong. And then finally, I realized, okay, I started to work with them. And so, I'll just show you some visuals of chapter 1. Let's see if I can make this full screen here. So, I started to collaborate with them. And the women quite often, especially the younger girls, who at 14, they would quit allowing them to go to school out of fear because they didn't have the protection of their own community. These girls are indoors all day long. So anytime that Khalto Tanya was coming, it was like, yeah, we're gonna have some fun. And the moms began to trust me as well. And we would just use, so it's a matter of when something's working against you, you can't show faces, you can't. Sometimes it forces you to be extremely creative, and it can bring you to another level. And so I used these hideous curtains that came to traumatize me as a curtain of, like a theater curtain. And the girls themselves would narrate and play, and it became a way of illustrating together, collaboratively, their stories. Like they would tell me, sometimes I would interview them, and I would come back and I was like, oh yeah, you said this to me, I've been thinking a lot about it. How could we illustrate that? And so it became performative, them using their own bodies to perform their own realities. And so each of the visuals in this chapter have distinct narrations and firsthand testimonies. Let's see, I'll show you one little interactive piece before I move on from here. And then, of course, there was the digitized reality. So at the beginning, in the Romantic period, a lot of these women, we're not talking about urban Syria, which is very urbane, a totally different reality. We're talking about Dera, near the border. We're talking about very rural, conservative area of Syria. And these women were, some of them married at 14, 15, and they were suddenly in love with their husbands for the first time because they were fighting, freedom fighters, and they were sending these very sultry texts back. And so their whole realities were sort of narrated on these interactions, and they would show me the poetry, the love poetry, but then as it continued, it became a very different reality. Like this, she actually got a couple of weeks around Valentine's Day, and then she received news that her husband had been killed. And actually, she's lucky. This is a Nokia digital funeral, if you will, because the majority of the women didn't get to even see the bodies. They either eviscerated, were desecrated, or taken. So the lucky ones, quote unquote, had this this memorial. So that's one chapter. I showed you the video. There's also 5 minutes. Oh gosh, you know what? I'm gonna switch it and go into. Damn, I had so much I wanted to show you guys. Okay. So, for example, then there's the little odds and ends that you don't know what to do with, but these people have poured their hearts out to you. This woman here, this picture here, she had been, by regime forces, brutally gang raped. And she'd managed to hide her child that she was still breastfeeding under the pillow and screamed out to the neighbors, but she was lactating in prison. And one of them, as he raped her, breastfed upon her and said, oh, where's your baby? Let's find your baby. Well, I alerted, this is during the unhappy UN period, I alerted them to her existence as an urban refugee. Nobody ever reached out to her. She actually said, yes, I would like to have some help. So I just gathered, there's a section where I gather these testimonies and hope that eventually, and then finally, this is how I danced, this is how I cried. I enter a lot of different homes, some of them that is controlled by very oppressive sheikhs. And I had the children document, but this is the case. I'll end it here. It's a case of choice, what you include, what you don't. This was the child that had been brutally murdered. And he happened, it was a Syrian family living in one of the Palestinian camps in Jabal Hussein. And I didn't take pictures. I listened for hours to the family. And I did snap this one. And then they themselves wanted to send me their WhatsApp video images that the police had given them of the boy, the 7-year-old boy who was due to finally start school. And he was a very bright child. And I'm sorry, I'm going to be blunt. He had been sodomized, his throat slit, his eyes gouged out. And the family shouldn't have had those pictures. I don't know what the police were thinking. But they showed me those pictures, and I was not going to use those pictures. So instead, I asked, do you have any images? And this is actually, so they ended up sending me pictures of the kid a couple of weeks before his death at the fun fair. They sent me pictures of him, dressing, excited that he was going to start school. So since I only have how many minutes? 2 minutes? I'm going to wrap up Syria via WhatsApp and just basically try to explain that there are people, there are organizations you can work with that will respect. Like I've had some horrible experiences working in the field, but then I've had experiences like MSF. I was hired by them and they treated me as a journalist other and didn't give me access. Versus Amnesty International and a 3-chapter project I'm working on them now with on the Nakba. And this is on Aida refugee camp. Berkeley just came out with a study. It's the world's most tear gas population on Earth. So they gave resources as opposed to treating me like a sort of irritant other, gnatfly, that a lot of NGOs and UNHCR organizations will do. Like, why the hell are you hiring me? These people, Amnesty, sent in a specialist in the field. So we conducted the interviews together. We talked beforehand. And in the end, we came out with, like, for example, this is a woman who didn't want her identity shown. So the pregnant mother is behind the daughter. She's had 3 miscarriages because of these continued tear gas on her. So the point of this is there are, hold on, I'm going to show you one other element of this website. Again, so the fact that somebody doesn't want their identity shown, it doesn't have to be a negative. You can find a creative way around that because the most important thing is their narrative, is their text, is their story. So find another way, even if it's just a sentence that they said that is strong, that conveys the message. And so with that, I just want you to think about, let's see if there's audio here, there should be. It's not working. Anyway. With that, I just want you to think about the alternative methods that you can approach your storytelling. And in fact, for those of you that are freelance, and you're like, I don't have the funding to create these alternative realities. Well, you know what you can do is you can use different assignments to your, like, I'll accept an assignment, for example, on baby Jesus Bethlehem. And that's the majority of the assignments I get based in Palestine. And what I do with that, I'm like, okay, someone's going to pay me $250. I'm going to make a new contact in the field and formulate a new relationship. And sometimes, like, for example, this was a guy who was trying to remember where a massacre had happened. Well, the massacre site has long disappeared, but I just walked with him and photographed. And so I'm just trying to say, to conclude with the fact that yes, we have a lot of restrictions around us, but you can find your own individual way. And if you're working as a freelancer anyway, you should be thinking out of the box. You need to find a new approach to be doing your storytelling. And there are partners out there that you can align with. And I think that one of the benefits of having a portfolio where you have deviated from the mainstream. So Apricots, I haven't found the dream media partner yet. But that Apricots project just gave me my first commercial assignment of a corporate pharmaceutical company that wants to do something a little more in depth on their breast cancer medication. So just don't be afraid, think out of the box, find new ways try to avoid the traditional top-down, interact, collaborate as much as possible, and be creative and respectful. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you one of the questions I was going to ask you a little bit later while we do that. You mentioned this intriguing thing toward the end, which is that on that last assignment you described, you said you went in with a specialist and conducted the interviews together. Talk a little more about that. What was that like?
To be honest, it was a game changer, and it spoiled me because that's how I would love to go forward. Usually, I'm either with a journalist, and there are some writers that we collaborate and do wonderful work. But when it came to a lot of the NGO or UN assignments, I was either hyper-controlled to the point where there was no point in being there, or left completely on my own. And so I do a lot of my own writing and interviews, but it's a lot. It's a lot of work to do the visuals and the interviews and the writing on my own, and it's exhausting. And after a while, financially, I just realized it wasn't worth it. So to go in with a specialist who respected my work, who understood the point of photography, which is not the case usually. And so we collaborated, not only the local Amnesty partners, but we spoke to the partners in London. And there was a consensus over our approach. And then as we entered the field, we worked truly in collaboration at time. And then afterwards, I would have an idea, why don't you interview them about this aspect? Or in their interviews, they would say something that would give me a visual idea. So when you worked with a specialist, it gave me not only in terms of the quality of the material, but it elevated things that I couldn't say. I couldn't say that leap that this woman had a miscarriage due to tear gas. That's something I wouldn't feel comfortable of my own expertise saying, right?
So this was a field researcher who was a human rights researcher who was specialized in documenting this stuff.
Exactly.
And I'm curious, what was it male, female, what woman? What was it?
Actually, the Palestine chapter was a male, but he was the little brother you always wanted. He just had a very good way, a very respectful way in the field. And then the Lebanon chapter and the Jordan chapter, which I just completed, was a female. But
and what did you find different in their approaches from what you might have done journalistically? How did it work together?
That's interesting. Yeah. I feel that they took their interview style at times. At first, I got irritated at times because I felt it was too dry. Yeah. And I was kind of like, oh my God, because they would say something fantastically emotional that I would want to unpack. And I noticed that they would ignore it and then continue on. So there was a scientific approach to A, B.
They're being very forensic because their
yes.
job is to get the data, right?
Precisely. But because they, again, were not just, because I've been in the field with the UN with science minds, but because they understood that what I needed was something different, then later I could ask them, they said this, how can we visualize that? And we would brainstorm together, and then I would sometimes go back on my own. It helped when I would, in the Palestine chapter, I'm based there. In Lebanon, we had to work differently. In Jordan, that was the hardest chapter to do because of the restrictions of working here.
Mm-hmm. And how did Amnesty use this work? Did they just put it out there, or
so they initially hired me a month before last year's commemoration of the Nakba, and they hired me a month before that day, and they said, hey, can you do 3 chapters and cover the Nakba in a month and create an immersive website? And I started laughing, and I said, yeah, that's not going to happen, mostly because of your bureaucracy. And so as a result of that, we've just been releasing it on different hook dates. So we've only released the first chapter, and I just finished the Jordan chapter actually a few weeks ago, and we're going to release the other 2 on the 71st commemoration of the Nakba. And what they're doing with that is they had their own, they released it online. They've used it, so far it's been an online release, and they're using it for their personal presentations. And at this point, I'm not sure. It's the first time that they've put money in something of the stature for the Middle East.
Fantastic. It looks like we have actual slides up.
Over to you, Sima.
But thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Should I turn off the lights?
That would be good, actually. Oh, criminy. So I am based in Cairo. I photograph, between Cairo and Beirut, I photograph news, spot news, color rendition is horrible, news, spot news, features, long-form features, and I don't do frontline conflict, but I do post-conflict quite a bit. And a lot of my focus is on that. But my kind of presentation is going to veer off a little bit from what Tanya was doing, because I think people don't really understand exactly what photographers kind of have to go through. And photography is a very in-your-face, invasive kind of form of journalism. I don't have the luxury of calling in an interview. I don't have the luxury of having space. And so I have to be there, or it's not what is this?
A clicker.
Oh God, this just complicates things, doesn't it?
You don't have to use it.
Okay. So a lot of times, especially if you're partnering with a writer or even if you're going out on your own, a lot of things is understanding when to actually photograph. Sometimes you're sitting in an interview and it's not the appropriate time. You know, your subject needs some time, so you kind of like have conversations and do the interview first, and you don't really photograph. And if you're working with a writer, that also applies, because sometimes the situation doesn't really allow for you to immediately just jump in and start photographing in someone's face. And most importantly, when to put your camera down. And I think a lot of people don't understand really that, in my opinion at least, humanity kind of always takes the forefront, and so knowing when to put your camera down is incredibly important. And of course, as Tanya said, creative solutions when you're faced with a lot of restrictions. And I find actually, like, if I'm given a broad assignment to kind of do whatever I want, and sometimes when you have really good relationships with photo editors and they trust your judgment, they'll say, go do you. You just do you. And I don't know how to work by doing me. I don't know me enough. So I put restrictions on myself. I'll only shoot in 35. I'll make sure I have like 3 planes. I will shoot only from a particular angle if I need. So I try and hone my skills constantly in order for when I am actually put in a situation that I need to come up with something creative, I can. And my number one rule in photography is everyone has human dignity and the right to human dignity. And when you photograph people, it's very important to keep that particularly in mind. And with that, I show you a photograph of Abdurrahman Rahmoun. And it's difficult to say there's much dignity, actually. And so it's kind of funny that I say everybody has a right to dignity. But this was an incredibly important portrait for me to take. It took me a long time to photograph this. It took me a long time to sit with the family and sit with his mother and listen to his story. And this particular one was the very beginning of the Russian invasion, occupation, whatever you want to call it, into Syria. And it was the very beginning of the Russian airstrikes. And nobody was really believing that the vast majority of the victims were children, and children under 16 at that. This boy was 16, at the time of photographing it, he was 16 years old, and his dream was to be an Olympic swimmer. So sometimes when I photograph, especially uncomfortable situations, and I'm trying to get the message across, my point is, if I can't go to Syria, how do I show the destruction on the lives of people? And sometimes taking a very uncomfortable portrait. I think for this particular one, the fact that he looks straight into the camera, the fact that he's looking straight at the audience, and you feel him looking straight at you. And it's supposed to be uncomfortable, because I think for this particular one, he's asking you and begging you to look at him, to look at the injustice. So what do you do when you have so much just out there? Like, everything is out there. It's oversaturated. There's just I find it so difficult sometimes to come up with a better way to photograph. And I think a lot of people really just miss the basics of what you put in your frame is a tool to convey a message. And it's really quite simple. The types of frames that you use, what you decide to take in, take out, your visual treatment of the image, whether it's black and white or color, all of those things are really just tools. Tools, in the end, if I'm not giving you the message, then you're not getting it, then I'm not telling you a better story. So understanding what all of these elements mean when you photograph is probably the most important thing. I mean, taking the time when you are shooting to understand that if I'm photographing a child at a wide angle and I am like flying on top of him and I'm making him look really, really tiny and he's got like a really kind of like grubby refugee face, what am I actually saying, and is that adding to the story? So understanding how you're photographing and what that photograph actually means, how it's going to be received on the other end, and how it's going to be digested is a very big part of this kind of oversaturation. I think I'm probably pretty sure you can agree with me. Like, one of the reasons why a lot of people stop seeing the pictures is because they're all pretty much shot in the same way, and so coming up with a better way is half the battle. So I think the number one thing for me, especially when I photograph very difficult things, is to understand why I'm there. Because without that, I don't think I can, having a purpose, a sense of purpose to, to why you're sitting and listening to this misery and watching this misery unfold, is an incredibly grounding thing, knowing that your work is important. And knowing that when you are there, that you're not just adding to the noise that's just, it's not worth me going if I cannot come up with a better way to tell that story, or a different way, or another angle. It's not worth putting the viewer through more images of more stuff they don't want to see unless I have a better way to say it. So yes, creative solutions, photographing inanimate objects, ways to cover faces, silhouettes, maybe focusing in completely on details or pulling all the way out into finding like a space, removing the subject entirely from the frame, a lot of different things. And sometimes, for me at least, at the very least, really thinking simply. Sometimes you can really overcomplicate things. You're put in a situation where you can't photograph identity. I was put in a situation once where I had to photograph somebody, and they said, you can't photograph the house, you can't photograph my face, you can't photograph my kids. And I was like, fuck. Can I photograph the wall? Is there a hole in the wall somewhere I can just maybe interesting light? So it was really difficult. I ended up photographing the subject smoking cigarettes. It showed that he was really tense, and you'll see a video about that. So yeah, I am against the dirty, grubby refugee kid face. And here is a creative solution. So I was on assignment for The Guardian. They came to me and they said, oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I can do it again in Arabic. Okay. So I was on assignment for The Guardian, and they said, I was having a conversation with this writer that I was constantly working with at the time, Patrick Kingsley, and he said, I want to do a story on, I don't think people understand what it actually means to, leave everything and get on a boat. They just really get the other end. So what does it mean? Here they are, they have a family, they have a life, and the situation is so desperate that they just leave with nothing. And so he and I had a conversation about how we're going to do this. One, because it's illegal in Egypt if you know about a potential illegal illegal migration, and you don't stop it or tell the authorities, so you are partly to blame. So this was kind of a big risk. This was kind of like when the law started to come into Parliament, and I was like, it's now or never. I don't think it's going to be retroactive. Let's do this thing. So we found some subjects who did not want to be photographed. And I walked into this guy's house, and we were having a conversation about what he's going to take with him. And this is what he's taking with him: his jacket, a passport, and a bottle of water. Everything to start a new life in Europe. And he said, I really don't want my picture taken. And I said, okay, I understand. Well, I'm looking around the room. I'm going into another room. It's just walls. I really have nothing to really go for. And so I said, well, how about this? What if I tell you I don't care that you don't want your picture taken, and I'm going to stick my camera in your face? What are you going to do? And he just put his hands up. And I photographed that. And that was the way to kind of get a reaction, and it was very natural, and it was his own way to cover his identity. And if you're interested in seeing the series, it's on The Guardian, it's on my website and on The Guardian. It's called Passport, Life Jacket, and Lemons. And it became a pretty big story, which was nice, because NGOs started to use that format, what people take with them. And it became a pretty large kind of interactive piece, and kind of blew up. I was quite happy about that. And so here's somebody else. His name is Hesham Sui. Those were the things in his bag. We had gone to see him first for this story until we became quite close with him and realized he was going to be leaving soon. And so what I want to do is show you, the point of saying this is that when you're there shooting one story, as Tanya said, you're always keeping your eye open for another story. And this story that I'm going to show you next, it's like a little, how do I do this again? Oh, there we go. Now what? Okay, so I don't use any of these things. I usually just walk and talk. So So this video actually was a multimedia thing that they came up with at the
What do
Guardian.
you take with you when you're...
Hold it, wait for it, yeah. So when they saw it kind of like blew up and everybody was kind of talking about the story, they decided to put together kind of like a 2-minute, 3-minute piece using my images from Egypt and Alexandria and different locations. And so this is the entire series, just like in a 3-minute video.
What do you take with you when you're forced to flee to sea? For many Syrians risking death to reach European shores, it's the bare essentials. Huthaifa, a young cook who'll set off from Egypt, wants to travel light. He'll only take a warm coat, 2 bottles of water, and key ID documents. Ahmed Abu Zaid, a 19-year-old shop assistant, is more concerned about going hungry, but he still keeps it simple. He'll take 12 bottles of water, cigarettes, beef, bread, dates, and seasickness tablets, and a brand new life jacket. Nizar, an electrician, can't afford a new life jacket, but it doesn't matter. He still has his old one from last year. He tried to go to sea last summer too, but was arrested before he could get on the boat, which was just as well. That boat later sank. Everyone knows the risks of going to sea. Abu Jana, a former Syrian soldier, is so certain his boat might sink that he's packed a laser pen. His wife has packed some lemons in case he gets seasick, but the laser pen will help him if he actually falls into the sea. Bobbing around in the waves, Abu Jana wants passing ships to be able to spot him. Abu Jana's life helps explain why Syrians are so desperate to leave not just Syria, but the whole region. At first, he didn't want to go to Europe. He went to Egypt instead and hoped to build a life there. But because he defected from the Syrian army, he can't renew his passport at Syria's embassy in Egypt. That means he can neither travel legally nor find work in Egypt or enroll at a university. It also means he can't get a proper rental contract. So like many Syrians in Egypt, he's been left in a bureaucratic no-man's land. Abu Jana wants to sail to Europe, even if it means dying in the process. It would be no great loss, says Abu Jana. Right now, he already considers himself dead. Lots of Syrians think the same way, he says. Maybe not physically, he says, but psychologically and socially, a Syrian is a destroyed human being.
So Patrick and I worked together quite a bit on migration issues, and that was kind of one of the really big pieces that we ended up doing together. It took us 7 months to find people and a lot of time for them to trust us. And so going back to kind of looking for the subtle, this was in a camp in Greece in an open, informal camp setting, and sometimes you just find the details that can kind of ask questions instead of you just always kind of like giving all the answers. And for me, that's very important because a lot of media and journalism is a conversation. This was here in Jordan, actually, on assignment for one of the UN agencies. And so that's usually feature stuff. You know, you have some time, you can talk to people, you really kind of get their trust. And a spot news story, that just does not happen. I mean, there's something that's happening and it's immediate and it's violent and traumatic and a million other things, and you don't have the time really to ask a kid or his parents whether or not whether they want their photo taken. And so I think shocking images are a reality. We have to photograph it. That is what is happening. We can't just sugarcoat life. And also understanding that when you're photographing these things and when you're with your colleagues in the field, because sometimes if it's a big thing that you are with your colleagues in the field, that you are a human being and that people break down and they break down on the spot and you need to cry and you need to hug and it's normal. It's just normal. There are times though where I would cry and other people wouldn't cry, and that's when I would go hide. Because I didn't think that was appropriate. So, I mean, they're all doing their thing. I can understand the monumentous situation, and I would go I'm going to go to the bathroom for a second, just have a cry. So I do that often. In a spot news story, you don't have the time to ask people whether or not they want to be photographed. It is an event that is taking place. It is immediate. This was on the boat, rescue boat, the Aquarius. Yeah, we're going to go through this. We're going to do it together. This is, a lot of it is photographing kind of another community and not my own. But here, you know, events unfold quite quickly. And you're trying to really just focus on the task. And then you have the chance to kind of heal from that a little bit later. This is a cop-out slide. This is my cop-out slide. I was trying to divide my work. It's just hard. When you're working with your own community and you're photographing your own community and you're photographing the loss and the grief and the pain, it's really, really effing hard. Because I think a lot of people do this, and I'm pretty sure my Syrian colleagues here do this as well. You always imagine yourself. And you have no other way to deal with that other than imagining yourself in that situation. And sometimes the guilt of not having it that bad. This was one of the images for me that I kind of like really mirrored my mother side. And a Syrian woman holding her 2 boys as they're going, as they just crossed from Croatia, having been on the road for 2 weeks. And the look on her face, for me, versus the look on the kids' faces, is really telling. Like, she's carrying all of that weight. And those boys are just like, Mom's here, I'm good, to some extent. And God, that was just such a big thing. And photographing that, I think, was really kind of like a, going back and editing it, I think. At the time, I was just kind of like, I'm doing this. This was an image that reminded me of my daughter, who's the exact same age. And this is what I say when you're photographing trauma on the spot and you don't have much choice. And also, this kind of intersects with when you put your camera down. This was a girl that was separated from her family after they had crossed into Croatia. She found herself on a train. Her family were not on that train. I was the only Arabic speaker amongst hundreds of photographers and journalists. And nobody could communicate with the Croatian police. And so I was walking down the tracks, and I could hear a girl yelling, and I look up and kind of hear a commotion inside of the train, that there's a girl that had separated from her family, and I'm not on the train. I don't really know what to do, and it's quite overwhelming, and I'm walking back down the other direction, and I can see a family distraught. And I thought, this is when you put down your camera. And so I went and I asked them, what's your daughter's name? And they told me their daughter's name. And I ran back to the other side of the tracks and I said, what's your name? And she told me her name. And I brought the Croatian police. And that was when I took a step back. And so I was able to photograph that moment when they were pulling her out of the train because it was so packed, she just couldn't walk off the train. And I think for me, it's a matter of knowing when to be human and when to take a step back, and knowing that there are other people that can help once you get that situation under order. Your job there is to document. Your job there is to be a journalist. Your job there is to show just how bad it is. And for me, the separation of children from their families that was happening during the migrant crisis, I think, was probably one of the most appalling things I had ever seen. And there were no UN agencies there. There were no NGOs there. There was just nobody there. It was just thousands and thousands of people. And quite difficult to be the only one speaking Arabic and being able to communicate and understand what was happening for me coming back, and knowing that I was the only one that could really understand what was going on because of the language, was quite devastating, I think, psychologically and emotionally for me. I was on assignment in Turkey for a completely different story, a long story, when the famous activist Naji Jarf was assassinated in Turkey. And I was in the same city he was in when he was assassinated. And these are my friends in this photograph, who are all activists of some kind or journalists of some kind. And I went to go photograph this event. I was able to sell it to my photo editor because I thought it was an important thing to do. And when you photograph your friends in grief, that's just a whole new level. But I really felt like I was doing some important work, and so I went with it. Sorry, go back. So photographing your community and kind of what happens to your community is Sorry, these might get difficult, just FYI. Are we done? Am I done? 5? Okay. It does get difficult. You kind of try and come up with stories along the way. I was in Jordan on assignment for something else when I started to realize how many burn victims there were, how many people were waiting for reconstructive surgeries. And so this is part of my long-term project on the wait for surgery. People who are affected by barrel bombs and burns, and just how much it takes for them to feel whole again when they're physically suffering. And in the same sense that I photograph the Syrian community and I consider them my community, of course, because I'm from Syria, I also live in Egypt, and I very much consider the Egyptian community my community. And so we have had a slew of terrorist attacks throughout churches and church bombings across Egypt. I specifically focus on these things, and I did not know how to actually photograph, victims of anything. So I started to find objects, and these are little kids' shoes, mother's shoes, if you look closely. And so without having to say anything, you show it. And I thought about this photograph when I was photographing, because I remember walking by this guy and thinking, God, it's just like, I know this is going to sound really crass and whatever, but the light is really nice. And I don't know, I want to photograph him. He is in shock. He's obviously in shock. And I remember thinking to myself, I have a few options here about how I can photograph this. And so I went really far back because it was a very reflective moment, and I did not think that my camera would help in that particular situation. But I thought that showing the blood, showing how bad it was very important. So for me, at the very least, the refugee story, so to speak, is our story. And when we speak of people, we really should speak of ourselves, because if you want to tell a better story, you want to think about how your story is being told as well. And for me, I only really learned that when I was photographing Syrians, and then got on the Aquarius, and there wasn't a Syrian in sight. And I was really put up against what racism looks like. And so, and I actually, a very funny, kind of not so funny, kind of sick humor type of story, is that I came back from the Aquarius, not a very good person in the head, and my ex-husband at the time thought it would be a really good idea for us to have drinks with friends. I did not think so, but I went anyway. And I remember sitting there having my 3rd gin and tonic, and somebody asked me, God, be on the boat, man. Must be really bad. You were there for 3 weeks, and that's pretty bad. And I was like, yeah, that's pretty bad. And he goes, what's the worst thing? And I just kind of looked at her and I said, this. And for me, it was really about actually, she goes, well, I don't understand. So I looked at her and I said, the table got really quiet. My ex-husband got really nervous. He knew shit's going down. So, so she's like, I don't understand. And I said, well, you see, because I photograph my community, I photograph the Syrians, I photograph a refugee crisis, and I go on this boat for 3 weeks, and it's just draining, because at one particular point I started to think to myself, what is the difference between me and this Nigerian woman? And I couldn't find the difference. I really couldn't. It killed me, and I couldn't find the difference, and then I found the difference. And then that made it worse, because I came back to Cairo, and I sat there with this woman, and I asked her, how would you feel if a Syrian woman kind of moved in next door? How does that feel? She goes, oh, it feels great. We'll exchange recipes, child rearing tips and all of these things. And I said, well, how would you feel if it was a Nigerian woman? And she just went, pass, hard pass, basically. And I said that was my biggest problem, is that it doesn't matter what it is that I'm photographing, that racism, that inherent racism is there. And it was very difficult for me to see it, because for me, the refugee story is all of our story. And it is all of us united in humanity. And I'm just an idealist, hippie love freak. But I am that way. And I think that's kind of, I try to make that the pool of source that I go to when I photograph. I am not a big fan of the dirty refugee grubby face. This is a beautiful refugee girl in Lebanon. I was on assignment for something, this was something else. I was on assignment for one thing, and then I'm always shooting for something else, and always taking that time. More refugees. So all of these are different assignments photographs of my people, of my community, of how I want to see myself, how I think we should all see ourselves, and all across the region. And you couldn't tell, really, anything. But for me, telling a better story is really kind of trying to find, in some selfish way, you know, how you want to tell, how you would want somebody else to tell your story, and how you would want to be photographed. And I think that's kind of like the essence of why photography can be powerful. You can be immediate and you can be hard-telling, and I think our story is the violence. It is the death. It is the destruction. It is the burial of friends. It is the sadness. It is the grief. But it is also kind of just moments. So that's it.
I'm going to start out with a couple of questions, and then we'll go to the room. I know you have a lot to say, but there are a couple of things I want to throw out at you. First of all, thank you, both of you, and also thank all of you for not only being here for our colleagues' work, but dealing with technical difficulties and being patient. Since I started out asking a question of Tanya, Sima, I'm going to start with you, just for equal time purposes. I was really struck by your decision to give that man the choice, this guy, the choice of how he wanted to be portrayed.
Right.
Right. And there's a kind of a collaboration in there, and a giving of a little power back to your protagonist. Right. It's almost making a collaboration out of this. What are some other examples or other ways that you have found to work in a collaborative spirit with subjects?
Well, it's funny, actually, the work that I did with the Magnum Foundation and Afaq was an incredibly collaborative project. And in fact, I told her, I am your tool. I am not part of this narrative. This is not my story. And so I did a story on a girl who had lived part of her life as a boy. And so I would prompt her to get her to think of different ways of how she used to live and how, you know, so it was like this. I said, well, how would you want me to show this? What would be your ideal way? And, you know, she would describe something, and so then I would photograph that and show her the image, and that's how we worked. I think collaboratively, I work with writers a lot, and I work with, you know, when they do interviews, I kind of hang back a little bit, listen in a little bit, and then we'll go back into the subject and say, you know, I picked up on this, and I, you know, thought about that, and what do you think if we, you know, maybe do a portrait in the garden? And they're like, no, and I would say, well, what's your favorite place? And then they would tell me their favorite place in their home, and that's where I would photograph them. So I think giving people agency and how it is that they want to tell their story is probably the most important thing. Because I really don't like it when other people tell my story. So, I mean, I really wouldn't, you know, I mean, it's like, I know me best, and I can talk.
Yeah.
So.
And let me ask something of both of you, but that picks up on something else you just said, Sima. When you showed one of those last images, the guy sitting against the wall, blood on the wall, and you said, I looked at this and I thought, wow, that's great light, right? Yes. Well, one thing that is true of both of you is that your pictures are beautiful, and you are dealing with this sort of tension between beauty and horror in a lot of ways, whether it's in your face horror or the backstory, right? Both when you're photographing and when you're putting slideshows together and things, how do you think about those professional qualities that are the aesthetics, the decision? I mean, like, Tanya, you have all of those pictures in the first set you showed in which children's faces they're the fully resolved faces, and adults are sort of off here somewhere. How do you think about that balance between the kind of aesthetic and craft and the subject, the political, and how the viewer is going to look at that?
Go ahead.
So, you know, early on,
You gotta turn it on.
this one, the big button in front of me. Okay. So early on, when I began, I felt guilty every time I would take an image. And I felt, especially if someone had just shared a particularly dramatic story, I felt guilty thinking of the aesthetic and very aware that I was taking. And I still am. It's still, to be honest, a guilt that I deal with it. And that's why I try to make it as collaborative as possible. But then I came to realize that if you're already, they're going through the sometimes trauma, depending on the story, to share that dialogue with you, and you're taking a crappy image or a snapshot, you've just wasted their time anyway. So I try to elevate. I try to think of, because I like the way you phrased it, what did you say, short circuit of the very beginning. That's the thing, is I'm very aware of the images that already exist, and so I'm constantly trying to think of another way in, especially since I work a lot on Palestinian issues, and that narrative is quite often closed. So I have to think very creatively about surprising someone and bringing them a different entry point in. So that's how I sort of resolve the issue of, it's not that I'm not taking an artistic picture of blood splatter per se. I'm just trying to be as respectful as possible and have someone want to enter into this dialogue.
Yeah, I would totally agree, actually. I would totally agree with that. I think being hyper aware, like I would say hyper aware of what's out there, because I don't think I don't think anybody gets more bothered by photography than photographers, honestly. Really, because you're always looking at it, and it's funny, is somebody gave me a book and I'm looking at the pictures, man. So for me, it's like, I don't know what you're talking about, I'm looking at the pictures. And it's because I'm really hyper aware of representation, and I'm hyper aware of what that image actually says and how that's going to be translated to an audience. And I think both Tanya and I actually come from like a visual communications background, and what an image actually means. So it might not be the technically most perfect image, but it says exactly what it is that you want to say. And so then it's a successful image. And so I don't know, I'm not the most technical person. I am not a gearhead. I have worked with the same camera. My stuff is beat up. I fix it. I tape it together. I don't know how to invest in a camera or in anything, really. And so so for me, it's really about what this image is saying. And like Tanya said, it's really, you want to elevate. You don't want to waste anybody's time. This is not gratuitous, for the sake of your own pleasure, watching somebody else's misery. And so you really have to have a strong sense of purpose, and you have to do your homework, and you have to study. Because if you're there just, because you think that you're going to get the shot that's going to kill the world, and you're like, you're probably not. And so at the very least, you're going to elevate the conversation and the visual representation of a particular thing.
It also struck me, even in that what you described several times as a very uncomfortable picture, the picture of the boy who lost his legs, there is a kind of profound aesthetic calm. Color, light, everything. It's a beautiful picture, and that's part of what makes it uncomfortable.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So when you're paying attention to craft, you're also in some ways increasing the emotional impact of the subject. Right?
Yeah, and I think, the thing is, what people don't what people don't normally see are the contact sheets of photographers, and so you shoot. The back end of this particular image, and why this image came out instead of any of the other images that I had photographed at that very moment. There's images with his mother in the frame, his cousin who is actually sitting in a bed right next to him, who has lost all function in his body, because he was also hit by shrapnel that went into his spine and basically, other than his head, can't move anything. So why this and how that this particular image was chosen amongst all of the other is really knowing your craft, I think, and knowing what it is that you're trying to say. And yeah, I could have chosen the picture with his mother in it. I could have chosen the picture with his cousin in it. I could have chosen any of those things. But while you're shooting, you're adjusting, I think. Do you do the same thing? While you're shooting, you're adjusting. You kind of go, not this one, not this one, not this one, not this one. Maybe. Okay, possibly. No. And then that's when you kind of know when to stop. Like you're just like, this is all just crap now. So and just like the one on the boat, It was like, I see the light coming, I know the light's coming, I see the light coming, I know the light's coming. And so you're just like boom, 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 and you're waiting and waiting and waiting. And you know when you have the image that kind of speaks to your soul without having to, like, we call it gimping, looking in the back of the camera. So.
Okay, so let's do a
Yeah.
few questions. Ibrahim, let's start with you. And then
The question is for Sima and Tanya. What are you doing when you get an assignment for a 30-minute with a writer or a journalist, and the writer or the journalist take 25 minutes talking and give you like a 5 minute to shoot?
I mean, you know, to be honest, the best relationships, I get better stuff when I'm with certain writers, and there's an amazing collaboration that can happen. And if it's a situation where, and I respect, because if he or she is not getting his time, there's no place to put my pictures anyway. And so quite often I will use that time. It's a great time because they forget about me. And I'm looking at the expressions of the person. I'm looking around the room. I'm listening to what the person being interviewed is saying, and I'm looking on the wall. I'm looking for any clues or visuals that are going to enhance this interview. So sometimes I'm with writers that are very respectful of the time and build that in. But if they're not, and I can pretty much read the situation as it's going, I work with if the person is comfortable. In fact, quite often 10 minutes into the interview, if I'm like, okay, this is where this is going, 25 minutes and 5 minutes for me, I will ask the person, I'll say, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Do you mind if I walk around and get some pictures? So every restrictive situation, it forces you to get creative and think out of the box. But usually what happens is we've developed such a rapport, but the writer, me, and whoever the people are being interviewed, that it's never 30 minutes. We will get that extra time, and everyone gets what they need to do, ideally.
Oh, now you're so lucky. So I got an assignment with a German economic magazine, like the #1 German. I don't read German, so I don't know. But apparently this writer flew in from Germany and was waiting for 3 months to get an interview with Naguib Sawiris. And so they call me, they hire me for this job, and I'm like, yeah, so I study the light, I study all the dimensions. I'm like, I'm down, because I know this guy is not giving me time. He's, top 5 richest men in the world, and he doesn't care about me or my pictures. And so I did exactly what Tanya said. I went in and I went, all right, this guy is going to take up an hour and a half, no kidding, and I will not get any time. It's not that I'm going to get 5 minutes. I wish I had 5 minutes. I was literally told I had 2 minutes and a half. And that was after I pissed off the subject. Because he thought that I spoke German, and I was just being polite by nodding. For an hour and a half. So and then in the end he was trying to make like small talk with me after the interview, and he just looked at me really angry, and I could not get a portrait that day. So I whispered in his assistant's ear and I said, can I come back on Thursday? And she said, yeah. I was like, listen, I just need 30 seconds. I don't even need 2 minutes. And so I went, and I had already been in that room. I already knew the light. I knew what time I was going, and it took he said, when I walked in the second time, he said, back again. And I said, well, something's happened, and I really need to get a solid portrait, and I'd done all the detail shots already. And so he said, well, you have less time than you did last time. And I said, okay, no problem. You stand here, you do this, look over there, we're done, hey. And he goes, you did it in 30 seconds. And I was like, I'm a professional. And so I left. Okay. So, yeah.
Okay, Linda. Yeah.
دقيقة يا بنتي. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, here we go. طبعا يعني بعد امبارح أنا مضطرة إني أقول إنه الأسئلة أو اللي رح أحكيه أبداً ما إنه شخصي، أوكي؟ بس عندي كثير ملاحظات. اختصرتهم، حاولت أختصرهم ب3 نقاط.
I expect nothing less from you.
Really?
but keep your many comments focused in time.
الأولى هي الصور المباشرة اللي عم نشوفها، سواء فلسطينيين سوريين، عم نشوف صور كتير مباشرة، وبالتالي عتبة الألم عنا كلنا نحن عم تزيد، وعم نرسخ الصورة النمطية جدا جدا للاجئ. بتخيل ما في حدا اليوم يعني بالقاعة على الأقل هون بيتوقع يشوف لاجئ لابس نظيف وحلو ومرتب لأن خلص كل الصور عطتنا صورة كتير نمطية عن اللاجئ، إنه هو هذا الحدا المغبر المعتر الفقير اللي ما بيعرف اتسترا. كتير بدي ركز على نقطة عتبة الألم. يعني أول مرة بشوف دم وشخص فاقد إيديه أو رجليه بزعل، تاني مرة بزعل، ثالث مرة، 10 مرة it's normal for me. أنا بتعود كتير على القصة، صدقا ما بعود بتعاطف. أنا عم بحكي كسورية مش كحدا يعني منه سوري. بالإضافة إنه هي على المستوى الشخصي كتير بتخليني أفقد الإحساس فيها لما بتكون بشكل متكرر دائما. النقطة الثانية في بعض الصور حسيت انه هي في ايد المصور موجودة بالصورة، مثل البيجامة المعلقة على البرداية لتانيا، مثل الترتيب الدقيق جدا لاغراض اللاجئ اللي رح يطلع بالبحر. انا طلعت بالبحر بس ابدا ما رتبت اغراضي، كنت مرتبكه لدرجه انه ما بعرف شو حطيت بالشنطه ونص الاشياء يعني كتير بتكون الحاله كتير كونفيوجن، فاكيد ما رح رتبهم ونسقهم بهالطريقه البيوتيفول الجميله جدا. هون حسيت انه ما كتير في حقيقه، يعني او بالاحرى اكيد في حقيقه، اكيد في لاجئ رح يسافر وهي شنطايته واغراضه، بس حسيت انه العفويه راحت من الصور وما في حدا، يعني ما حسيت انه كتير بيجامة معلقة على البرداية. ما حدا بيعلق بيجامة على البرداية حتى وإن كانت لشخص متوفي. يا آخر شيء ناجي كان مديري، نو اتس اوكي. ف يعني كتير وزوجته هي ماي بيست فريند، بس لليوم ما عم بقدر ولا عم تقدر ولا اولاده بناته عم يقدروا يتعاملوا مع الصور الحزن اللي نزلت على ناجي. انا لليوم بشوفه عم يضحك في صوره يعني ذا بيست عندي، وهو باحد الورشات يعني منفعل وعم يبتسم. هاي الصورة اللي رح ضلني شوفها، وأنا آسفة لأنه إذا تصالحت مع الصور الجنازة، لأن هي جنازة، إذا تصالحت معها وشفتها بشكل عادي، إذا رح أتصالح مع كل صور البشاعة اللي موجودة بالحياة. So I'm sorry، بس صور الجنازة حسيت يعني شكرا.
ممكن جاوب. I'm gonna answer in Arabic. حجاوب بالعربي. So أولاً I think ناجي كان ملهم إلنا كلياتنا، لو حتى عرفناه شخصي ولا لا. أنا كمصورة صحفية بتحط بمواقف إنه لازم أحط آرائي الشخصية وأفكاري الشخصية على جنب لغطي حدث أو لوري حقيقة. وانا بالنسبه لي هدول الصور يلي عم تحكي عنهم يلي بيبقوا عندك اهم شيء المفروض يبقوا هيك for sure. بس انا بالنسبه لي كمان انا عم غطي حدث، وحدث بالنسبه للمجتمع السوري يلي هي المجتمع ممكن نقول الاوبوزيشن كان مهم. فصور الجنازه بالنسبه لي كان مهم. وقت انا كنت عم نقي الصور للسلايد شو نفسه شلت صور مرته وشلت صور امه اللي كانت موجوده، فشلت صور ناس ولا امه اي ثينك، شلت صور ناس كانوا كثير قراب عليه وهن عم بيحزنوا، فاخذت الصوره نقيت الصور يلي هن كانوا بعاد شوي لهذا السبب، فعشان اعرف يعني اوري الموضوع من غير ما هي. فالشغله الثانيه بس حلاحظ عليها على موضوع الترتيب تبع الهي. احيانا في التصوير نحن ما فينا نعمل كل شيء همجي، ونحن بنعرف يعني يمكن I might switch to English here بس I do this thing back and forth. نحن بنعرف انه when you leave you're just packing your stuff. You can look at my bag and my bag is a mess really, and I've been here for 3 days. So the idea is that there are specific tools you give in photography to clear up the picture for people to understand. It's not about whether his bag is messy or not. It's about how little they take. So in order for me to show how little they take to start a new life, it has to be clear. And also for there to be consistency in an edit all the way through, so the images can be incredibly powerful and you're not thinking about all these different elements in the frame. You have to sometimes make it look static.
If I may. I think there's something that is interesting that happens when you're documenting either Palestine, Syria, any of the various issues, LGBTQ in the US. There's this tendency of a what I call call-out culture. And I think that quite often calling in is far more of an interesting dialogue. So, for example, in the picture of the pajamas hanging, absolutely not. They put that there for me. And if you read every single narrative, I have a whole series of these items that people brought out because, again, I'm not able to show their faces. I'm not able to but I want to narrate their stories. And for me, their dialogue is much more important. I'm not pretending this. I'm actually finding a visual representation of their story. So I have an entire series of these sort of items, and it's essential to read. Again, to get the nuanced picture, it's essential to read those stories with the pictures. And I think that by us being there, whether you're as a filmmaker in your case, whether you're working with archive material, whatever it is, our hand is always there. And we're always going to be changing the environment to some degree. So in Sima's case, she's not literally filming his knapsack that he grabbed and jumped and ran with. So we're doing a visual narration and we're trying to invite people in. She's not pretending that this is literally how he laid those items out. On the contrary, but if she just photographed the piles like that and it's a crappy snapshot, is anyone really going to look at it? So whether it's video or still, I think that when you sorry, you can hear it if I'm like this.
Yes.
Okay. you have to understand that there is going to be that extra step of our presence. Our presence is there. Now, some photographies, absolutely, it's heavy-handed or it's cliched or the person is just being reduced to an object, war porn, etc. That's an entire different issue. But I think that one would need to understand the actual field of photography. And then that's a whole entire conversation.
I just add something about? I just want to add something about the raising the bar of how much somebody can handle in viewing difficult images, and I 100% agree. And I think this is exactly what Tanya and I were saying: is that you try and have a little bit more of a nuanced story. The difference between maybe Tanya's long form work and because I still kind of go back and forth between spot news and short features and long form features. So I really am and I do commercial work and NGO work, and so there's a lot of different ways that you can photograph. And a lot of the bar for what people are willing to stomach in violence is it is getting kind of just overdone, which is why I think Tanya and I both stressed that the smarter way for photography is the more nuanced way. It's the stories like the knapsack. It's the stories like the
the pajama, that whole entire series. And if you read the text, that woman is talking about her husband, and she's actualizing his story, and she's visualizing him in a way beyond the standard. Here's a picture of what he looked like as a refugee, etc., etc. He doesn't exist anymore. He's dead, and this is a method of her sharing her story.
Yeah, and even those boat pictures, everybody's seen boat pictures. Like, everybody's tired of boat pictures. So I tried, at the very least, if I'm going to say anything about these boats, I want them to at least know that it's really damn packed. And I think that's the feeling that you get. And I tried really to go away from the cliches of the people yelling in the water and the people, because I don't think it does anything. I'm not there to just add noise, but what I really wanted to show by showing a multitude of people and hyper-focusing, because the sun just came right on this guy's face, was to show that there is the one in the multitude. That was the point, that we are all kind of, in this together, in this boat together. Go ahead.
Look, I also think there's another issue, which just as we have in this room people who are reporting out to the world and reporting versus reporting for your own community, there's no universal viewer, right? There's no, people are all of us, when we look at pictures, are going to bring our own experiences. And if a photograph is going to be read in light of those things, and I think that's a big part of it too. Yeah, go.
So this audience thing is what I want really to ask about. Being like from here and still working mostly for international outlets, and maybe because of you now you're working also on a platform that for Arabian photographers. Do you sense that the Arabian audience are different from the international ones in the way they receive things? Would the local audience like a photo that international audience want, and vice versa? So when you work for the local projects, do you work with another approaches when you're working for international outlets? And this multimedia thing that we saw with photographs, with the voiceover or with sound effects or so, it's rarely that we find it in Arabic. I don't really find such kind of production in Arabic versions. So do you think it might go on, might be a good sample to work on, or do you think that local audience are not too much into this?
For me, as a dual national raised between places and obsessed with feeling constantly to justify my own existence, I'm hyper aware of audiences. And I actually feel that when I'm documenting a community, and despite the fact that I live in Palestine, I have 2 Palestinian children, and I'm raising them proud within that identity, I'm not Palestinian, and I'm very aware of that and very sensitive when I'm documenting. And so when I do my long form projects, I have a roster of anthropologists, psychologists, friends, teachers, people journalists that I respect, and I show them and I ask, how is this being perceived? And occasionally they might say, this, and I won't always agree with them, but I always, so for me, if you're documenting a community, and it might be things that they don't want to talk about in there, it might be something ugly, something that people like to push under the rug, sometimes, depends, but if the community themselves doesn't recognize who they are within it, then you failed. You have absolutely failed. At the same time, I'm aware how this could be perceived within a Western media. And so I try to find those images that I try my hardest to balance that. I will never send, if I have imagery that I know is going to just be eaten up, and hey, cue in a woman in hijab in an ocean. Woo, the West is going to eat, cue in hijab, period. The West is going to eat it up, right? But if it doesn't add anything to the narrative that I'm trying to talk about, I'm not going to just give them any sort of visual porn that they can consume in that way. So I think that I personally am always thinking about audiences and how it's going to be received.
Yeah, I agree. I do the same. But I also think, like, if you are welcome in your community, your own community, and the community of others, then and they appreciate your work, then that's successful. I don't know, like I said, I'm an idealist, hippie love freak, and I think that pictures are universal, and so I think a touching image is a touching image for all, because I really believe in that kind of common string in humanity. But as a photo editor, change that a bit. And as a photo editor, when I'm working with photographers, there's a couple of things actually. I am very aware of how I present myself in Egypt and how I look. I don't look Egyptian, for sure. I cannot blend into certain communities, no doubt. And there was a project that went, actually, I think you were his mentor. Mehdi was your?
Mehdi, yeah.
Okay. So Mehdi came to me, the photographer came to me, this project like years ago. And I have been trying to get into this community for years before him. And I was just like, I can't do it because of how I look. And when I saw him do it, I really encouraged him. I encouraged him to actually apply to this program. And he is the better storyteller for that. So I think also knowing that audiences can understand, I think audiences aren't dumb. I try not to make anybody dumb. And I think Arab audiences are just as intelligent as people abroad, and, all of their glory. I think we have often sorry for the white people in the room, but a white man complex in the Arab world, that we idolize that, and I'm hoping, and the only reason why I don't do multimedia yet at Madam Masr, where I photo edit, is because we are blocked in Egypt, and we have to work on a mirror site. So my technology doesn't allow me to, even though I have already put together multimedia pieces.
But to add to that, but to add to that, there's a lot of amazing multimedia work coming out.
Absolutely.
There is an ADPP, which is a program I encourage many of you to look at. It's basically 6 intensive months of training and 2 trips to Beirut. Mahdi did a deep investigation into a corrupt corporation that is polluting his community outside of Alexandria, and is it's dangerous time for him to be doing that. But the work is, and he's taking these multimedia approaches. Thus far, he's having more success showing that in galleries and places in Europe and the U.S. But I think right now there's the problem is that there's a growing interest in photography and videography and people doing amazing work in our region, utilizing different tools. But I don't think we have yet our own platforms other than Instagram, which has been an amazing tool. They're coming, but the point is nobody, and that's why I respect what you are paying. People want free imagery. We don't have the institution to support this sort of photography, but that is changing, and that is partially up to you.
That was very important to make sure that photographers get paid.
Okay, next. Go. What's a good way for writers and photographers to work together? And I ask because some of the most rewarding projects have been where I'm with a good photographer, but as a writer, often I get attached to the photographer who already has her project. And when I propose as a writer, like, I'd love to work with this photographer, I find photo editors, that's almost a red flag for photo editors that, writers have bad taste and we're going to pick somebody else. And so what have been your most fruitful collaborations, and how can we make that happen better? Or
I'll just go really quick with Patrick, because Patrick and I's work, we worked together for a year and a half. He ended up writing a book. My pictures were in that book. And we did a lot of work together over refugee and migration stuff. And Patrick and I, there is a natural symbiotic relationship. I think if you have like a good vibe with somebody, that always is great. And most importantly, Patrick and I respect each other, incredibly respect each other's work and respect each other's space. And so when we would go into a place together, we would often talk about how we would approach a particular subject. Also knowing that if you're walking in with a translator, because he has a translator or a fixer, I didn't need one, but we were walking in 3 people into somebody's house or into somebody's tight space. You have to be really aware of what that looks like and how that's perceived. And so we often will talk about just what I will be doing while they'll be interviewing, so I can just go off and like shoot something in some kitchen somewhere, and then I can come back, and then we would change. And so I guess the best advice that I can give you to work with a photographer is to prepare and to have a conversation. Yeah.
How do I sell
a particular photographer? One piece. Well, you know what? To be fair, there are certain photo editors that are insulted that you're even. Yeah. This is their domain, and that's hard when you have. But there are other photo editors that are curious, and quite often one way around it, I have found, is because I'll pitch ideas to my writer friends, and it's technically my pitch, right? So if they take it and work with another photographer, that's pretty damned unethical. So, not to say it hasn't happened, but what I find is I will help them put together a pitch utilizing my images, and that actually helps them even get the commission to begin with. And they'll say, this idea came from, we've already started, we've got these contacts. That's one way around it, but it's just really, they're the god.
I want to ask, we're going to have to stop, but I want to ask one final question that to return us a little bit to children, the ostensible reason for us being here, but also because both of you have the children in your photos are so kind of comprehensively human and vivid, and I'm just wondering what you think of as the special choices, the distinct choices that you face on children, especially younger children. What's the same, but there are some special choices involved in getting past cliche, in giving them life and dignity and all that. What are some of the choices that you've made?
It's interesting because in our region there's this phenomenon of children. What they love to do is they're replicating it. They do this or this if you're in Palestine, or actually also Syria. And I mean, you can only have so many. Actually, I don't include any of those pictures, although this does make me laugh. And but the thing is, in the case of, so quite often I avoid children because children are the easy access to in most cases. But in the Syrian situation, and Palestinian, Lebanese, I get more of a varied access. But because a lot of the women, either they're conservative, or they just don't want or they've gone through a trauma and they don't want that out there. But quite often I find 99.9% of the time they are comfortable with their children, and at the same time I always enter in dialogue. The camera is the last thing that comes out, if it comes out, and the children will again, it's like and they're bored and there's like woo, and so quite often the children will become the agents of the mother's story, right? And so in like, for example, the horrible story that I mentioned about the woman who had been raped, I mentioned that the picture I've never used anywhere other than this addendum to the mother opened the door with her children, and she was Snow White. If I'd ever met Snow White in the flesh, it was her. You know, it was very nurturing to her children. But we went outside of that room because what she wanted to tell me would have been very damaging. And
so thinking about boundaries and stuff like that. Yeah.
But the children, again, it can be very respectful. It can be a point of liberation, and they can be the agents of the greater story.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think of children any different than I mean, I know that sounds really crazy in a room full of mental health professionals, but I think I don't necessarily think of children as different human beings. I mean, anybody who knows how I raise my kids, they're people always laugh when they come over and they see me like try and like wrangle my kids, because I talk to my kids as if they're adults sometimes and give them agency.
What about aesthetic choices?
So aesthetic choices, I don't know. Kids do kid things, you know, and I think just doing just being, I don't pre-plan that, you know. Like I walk into a place and I see a kid playing with something and I think it's really interesting, and I see a nice light and I can do a composition, then I'm down for that, you know. But I'm not sitting there going, oh, I'm going to go in, there's going to be some kids there, I'm going to make sure that they do this, and I can't do that because I don't know what I'm going to come across.
I like to ask them. I'm like, hey, how can we tell this part of the story? And the kids are like,
oh, actually, there's one thing, because you said you don't take your camera out. I wanted to make a point about that. I actually always have my camera out. It is the exact opposite, because I don't want people to be misinformed about why I'm there.
Okay. So two different approaches. We are going to have to stop. We will take a 15-minute break. And continue to harangue these people during the break. But thank you both.